Hi. There's lots of seats down the front here. Please come sit down. I'm Dan Rule. I'm one of the directors of Perimeter. For those of you who haven't met me before, really thrilled to be finally launching Nihilartikel by Izabela Pluta, a book that's been a long time in the works, from a body of work that's been sort of developing and shifting over a long period of time as well. Just like to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to pay our respects to the elders, past, present and emerging. I guess today we've got a panel assembled. This is Paul Mylecharane, the designer of the book and a long-term collaborator of ours, and Daniel Boetker-Smith, the director of the CCP, and also a long-term collaborator and friend of Perimeter, we might say, and photo book aficionado. Sorry.
Photo book buyer.
Yeah. We can say that, but I was trying to not be so crass. But yeah, look, we're just going to talk around the book, around the concepts of the book, around the making of the book, and feel free to ask questions at any time, jump in. All very informal. But Izabela, I guess a good place to start would be with this somewhat obscure title that I'd never heard of before, Nihilartikel. Mm-hmm. And I guess, the term and how it relates to the work, how you came across it, and we can go from there.
Yeah. I think, the term is a German term, for, and I came across it at some point when I was probably looking through Google, probably researching something in relation to underwater ruins and formations, and thinking about time and diving. And I was saying to Daniel today that I actually can't remember the exact point at which I found that word, which is kind of interesting in relation to the book, because the book is sort of all bound up in these ideas of knowing and not knowing, and understanding a sense of location, or thinking about what we see and believe and where that comes from, that kind of believability of a certain place or a certain understanding of self, or where you come from, or where I come from. And so the ocean kind of had a bit of a play in that, in terms of diving, and how I sort of started thinking about diving as a way to disorientate me from a place, in relation to not being connected, being untethered, and how that could distort a kind of certain accuracy, or a certain accuracy, which then kind of had to do with mapping, and kind of really interrogating what mapping meant, and cartography, and those systems of cartography, and through how you how something is kind of complete. So Nihilartikel, in a long, rounded kind of explanation here, is a word that, from what I understand it to be, could actually be a complete hoax, could be something which is completely fake. And I became interested in it because it's a nothing term, or its translation literally from Latin is a nothing article. And if you do a bit of searching and kind of, dredging up, it appears that it actually was made up through perhaps academic circles, and it first appeared in a Wikipedia article in the 90s, and so on. You can kind of imagine where the trail of that leads, probably absolutely nowhere. So, and that's kind of, interesting, because it's very cyclical, and it's also very labyrinth-like, and I think this work ended up a bit labyrinth-like in its making.
Yeah. And can I... You go. So I guess maybe it's good to also just ask at the outset, like, how you see this work fitting in the short answer version. How you see it fitting into kind of your kind of practice, and the linearity or non-linearity of that practice. Because also this work was made over a number of years, right? And you kind of came to it and then went away from it and came back to it. And so how do you see it kind of in hindsight? How do you see it kind of fitting in that kind of lineage or that progression or something?
Yeah, I think part of the issue that I've had with photography is that it's a grappling. It's a kind of thinking about it should be logical and linear, but I often jump between bodies of work across time. For those of you that are friends or know my work, it's rather kind of hectic sometimes. And it also is sort of trying to perhaps not stick to a particular visual logic. Not trying to, but I just seem to do that. Like, I find it just intuitive, and the way that it rolls is really feeling my way through a particular experience or through a particular location, whether I seek out to approach or visit that location, whatever unravels there unravels, and I deal with the repercussions when I get back, and I deal with the material, and I form it, I shape it into something from, I guess, field work, if you like, through experiential kind of things like underwater, like diving, where this actually kind of did begin that. Like, it began there in terms of a dive that I did in Yonaguni-jima, an underwater rock formation in Japan off the coast of the westernmost tip of Okinawa, and where I thought I was there to do one thing, but it very quickly turned out that it was really about this sort of sense of not knowing where my body was. It really became about how I thought about my body in relation to a certain space and uncertainty, and not knowing where I was and why that was happening in relation to vastness and a whole body of water, and being kind of completely out of my comfort zone. So have I? Yeah. So.
And I guess connected to that, the second part of that is also, I know your family here today. It's like,
yes, they are. Yeah.
But it's also about the kind of, it's quite personal too in some way. Like, it charts. I mean, a lot of your work is quite personal and deals with your kind of family history and migration and language and all those things.
Yeah.
And it feels like this work is kind of, on the one hand, abstract and kind of dealing with these kind of layers and layers and layers, but also incredibly personal as well.
Yeah. And I think we're talking about this little quote. I was thinking about something that Ramona Hyleen wrote in the text as part of the book. Ramona is a writer, historian, working between Frankfurt and Vienna. And she sort of wrote this sort of, reflection of the work and the way that I perhaps think about longing and remembering things. And she sort of brings up the fact that I, of course, spoke German for some time when I lived in Germany, briefly when we were migrating to Australia, and that I, of course, have forgotten that language, or whatever I knew of that language since. So I think the sort of logic of the lure, perhaps, of using that German term comes back to that.
Beautiful, yeah.
Yeah.
I thought he was going to leave.
I know. I think he's asking not to sit down.
I thought I've had enough. Sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, perhaps it's useful to talk to some of the different sort of photographic modes and
Sure.
and bodies of work in this collection before we dive deeper in. There's obviously the mapping, the contact prints from the darkroom, but
Reversed maps. Are they reversed?
Well,
and
they're sort of collapsed as well. Sorry, we hung this today and then we realised it was upside down, but we thought we'd go with that because that's what Paul would do, right? I think the beginning, in terms of the material beginnings, I think of some of this work, or most of it, was in the darkroom, which was involving atlases or particular. It was an older work from 2017, but by the time I got to making this, it was working with an oceanic atlas of the Pacific that was published in, I should just know that, it's 1974. It was published by the USSR then, which is interesting now. And when I first sort of exhibited the exhibition kind of version of this project, it was just after the Russians had invaded Ukraine, and all of that had a whole different kind of meaning. It kind of became quite more complicated, I think, in the way I thought about those maps. And those maps were, the atlas is beautiful. It's this huge, atlas of the Pacific Ocean. Another one exists of the Atlantic Ocean, which I don't have my hands on. They're quite expensive, rare things these days. But I went about completely unpicking, unhinging that atlas, taking the pages out, and taking them into the darkroom and using that very simple process, which us photographers would say is just contact printing, making like a photogram. But what happens during that is, of course, light passes through the paper of the album and it fuses together the two images that are on both sides of the paper. And because I have this resistance to using glass to fix it, to kind of make it completely sharp and repeatable, like to make it, sharp, legible, then the image kind of instead, it has this sort of uniqueness. It also has these undulations, these sort of moments of softness. You can see that happening here in the paper. And I should just say that this is an enlargement of one of the smaller prints. It was made for the Bowness Prize a few years ago. So, but wait for an example to kind of speak to, I guess, because it does, amplify these undulations and moments of softness. So that's kind of one of the works. And then the lost sort of drone footage became part of that as well. So when filming and being taught as an kind of amateur how to fly a drone by a friend, and drone supplied by my father over here, I crashed a drone accidentally into the cliff from which this rock face fell away from in Gozo, the smaller island of Gozo in Valletta, when I was desperately trying to kind of film and experience through diving this sort of the debris of a limestone cliff that had fallen and collapsed in a kind of instant moment underneath the sea in 2017, and I got there in 2019. So this sort of different temporalities of time, and fast time or quick time, and long and sort of endured time when thinking about this sort of sunken rock in Yonaguni. So time and photography, and kind of thinking about, I guess, a range of photographic processes.
Zooming in and out.
Zooming in and out, yeah.
Part of it,
Yeah, exactly.
I guess those tensions are very, they're inherent in, tensions between modes, between sort of forms of photography and its installation, its presentation, are inherent in your sort of broader practice. Which, when you think about, I guess, just, even this body of work and how you've presented that, for those of you who've seen it documented, or different, installations of it, there's essentially an architectural armature in the centre of the space, which is a kind of a way I'd never seen photography kind of approached before, with various sort of plates and planes refracting at different angles, creating, these further tensions. The work is disorientating, it's both precise and kind of vague, and likewise while there's sort of formal prints hung around a room, there's this sort of refractions and disorientating kind of I guess it's almost like an aperture in the middle of the space, something you have to look through or look past too. I guess this sort of idea kind of made me think of how Paul, one of the main reasons we really wanted to work with Paul on this book was this sort of idea of I guess creating collisions, creating juxtapositions, which I think is something that you often, compared to other designers, really are willing to do.
I like to try and mess with photography as well.
So I guess it'd be fantastic to get a sense from you, Paul, to speak to kind of, I guess, some of the challenges or attitudes or approaches you took to...
No challenges really, but I think it's you kind of have conversations with an artist, but I feel like the conversation happens in the book. And it happens with how you work with the content and how you perceive it as well as a designer. And it's not to make much of the form of that, because I feel like that's just a small part of it. It's the work itself. And I think after our conversations that we'd had, I perceived all of those things that you were talking about, mostly almost binaries. There's a lot of, not just binaries, but zooming in and out and kind of all of the different kind of things, and wanted to kind of create a framework for disorientation, but and also to show this idea of kind of coming in and out of frame, and going from either these large-scale images, like the photos of the maps, to the actual water itself, but also then allowing them not to sit by themselves and then to become layered. Like just trying to respond to the way you've worked with it, even in terms of hanging as well in the past as well. So.
Yeah, we talked about that. Yeah,
I mean, the way I responded to the work, also to the book. I mean, knowing both of you and knowing how you both work, I think the thing that I've always been struck by with Izabela's work is that it's very hard to categorise, right? It's always been very hard to categorise. Like, what does Izabela Pluta do in terms of your work? And and I think that. And that's beautiful, that in terms of your practice, in terms of the book, it's they're always very different as well. But there's something that kind of connects them. And I guess the thing that struck me with the book is that you're dealing with layers and you're dealing with kind of error, but not error, if that makes sense. But I guess through the use, particularly of repetition in the book, I found myself kind of looking and then thinking, okay, here I see this image again. Did I miss something the first time around? And going back to so maybe what's happening here? And it forced me to delve into those layers because just of the simple use of repetition. It allowed me to kind of become a little bit disoriented with it in some way, not just through the use of these kind of overlays of colours, but also having the feeling like I've missed something or I haven't delved deep enough into one of the layers because you're showing it to me again. I'm like, oh, hold on, did I miss something the first time,
Yeah. Well, that's with the choice of block colours too, which are in between. Like those moments of like feeling like the whole thing, if you think about it as a grid, is just a square of imagery and a way of kind of like the grid itself is a way of kind of like making sense of space. Then you can actually then put all these layers together, create a framework which they move around, and they're just like escaping the images, A big block of black is escaping that black and white image next to it all. Yeah.
I think, one of the, it's often within, I guess, photo book discourse, especially around design, I guess it's quite a conservative approach. Often it's about like replicating what we see on the wall in some way. Where what I really love in this sense is that and I think it was for Justine and I thinking about, when we were thinking about making this book with Izabela, it's like, we got to get these two together because for the reasons we were just discussing, but also, Izabela, I think, Paul, you have the courage to do this kind of thing. Like, I think, like, to not just sort of say, I'm going to try and mimic what Izabela does. It's more like I'm going to take the idea and translate it. It's that book, the idea of design and bookmaking as a translation of work, not a replication or a representation of work. And I think
it's another work itself.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's really fantastic too. Like, the process for me was really interesting to sit back and watch and give occasional notes here and there. But there's a real generosity. I felt like there was a real generosity between you two as well. Like,
yeah, well, it's nice to be able to actually work with someone's work and not kind of just put it on the page.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? That's a real difference, and I feel like that's part of what I'm interested in as a designer, and not being a trained designer is actually just working as an artist almost, and making it into an artist object.
And I think also it was, sort of feeling our way through those conversations that we had and that early kind of, I feel like I sat there on Zoom for an hour and a half and there was a PowerPoint and all of these notes, some of which I have here and some of it were just words that I was pumping out, like, to weather, to collapse, to disorientate, distance, all of these kind of keywords, I guess, if you like, but also talking through the installation sort of, I wouldn't say version, but just the first work that this came from, which was a museum or gallery work, but knowing that this wasn't supposed to be a catalogue. This was kind of a kind of companion, a kind of partner. It was just another way of thinking through all those images, because this actually includes more than whatever the exhibition was or whatever is around in relation to that project, that it was a way of almost further complicating their relationship, because I also remember when I sat there in that cafe with Justine and Dan and I showed you through all the images, I felt like I was a little bit crazy almost, thinking about this all works together in my head. There are, clearly like 6 different visual kind of, languages of work, but these all fit, and thank you for trusting that kind of leap but yeah, so when Paul and I, when we spoke, it was really about how this can become a kind of another sort of residue, a form that is itself speaking to all of these ideas that
I think the other connection for me is that if you see your work installed in a gallery, this book also makes sense in that regard too. Like, it does feel very you as well. Like, it's not like it's a separate body of work, as you said. It's its own kind of body of work, its own work in a way. But it also feels like it has a very strong connection to the way you install work in a gallery space and the way you deal with layers and tactility and those relationships in the installation as well.
Yeah, which is less about formal photography in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah.
It's utilising
absolutely.
photography as a kind of way of feeling through.
Yeah, like moving through objects.
It's a media, not just a formal approach to it,
I don't know. I had a question about coming back to the kind of personal stuff around migration, and I think one of the key things as I was looking through the book is very much it feels like it's about transitory spaces as well, like the layers, but also kind of moving through spaces.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, not to get too personal, but I just wonder, like, that seems to be a theme that comes up again and again. This, if you look at the text at the start of the book, which I love, it's all very much about spaces and places, isn't it?
Yep.
Like, are we doing a reading today, Dan?
No,
maybe
but
we can ask Izabela
would like to. Can I read a couple of these? Because they're actually, thank you, because they're actually sort of so cut away. They're not really sensical. They're
and they feel transitory too.
So I'll just read a few of these, which we were kind of a bit stuck for a while there on where to put them, So they're notes untethered. The supposed horizontal displacement of portions of the original continent, the angular distance of the sun either north or south of the equator, one of the deepest parts of the ocean, forming a depression in the seafloor of limited area, a territory which is governed by a state from which it is remote, the laying down of solid material which has been carried from a distant part of the Earth's crust, the wearing away of the land surface by various natural agencies, a weathering process which consists in the peeling off of thin layers of rock from the surface, an outlying territory belonging to one country which lies wholly within the territory of another. I might stop there, but I am not a writer. I am an image maker, I guess. So I wasn't. I kind of really resisted writing anything for the book. But these definitions are from the Penguin 19. My brain is not on yet this year. The 1984 Penguin Dictionary of Geography, of which there are about 27 editions. And I became quite fascinated by that little, very small book, which has a lot of pictures, examples of things like a maelstrom, the Badlands, these kind of quite generic, broad, sometimes problematic terms that are kind of classified in these volumes. So when you remove the word from that definition, the definitions sort of seem to float and I think speak much more openly and broadly to the way we think or feel or experience particular, places that I have responded to or experienced when I have either dived or where I was in certain places in Australia and overseas. So it made sense to kind of use them, to kind of extract them and use them completely out of that context because they took on a whole new meaning. And they do correspond to some of the works that are in the book. which are the small images from the atlases of geography that again have been collapsed. This kind of collapsing of forms into new forms from geographies that have been, tampered with, I guess.
And just the notion of these series of definitions that have been kind of with the actual terms themselves removed. So I felt like it just speaks so well to the broader work as well. It's about location, but it's not about it's about the evocation of a feeling rather than the specificities of place, you know. Which kind of speaks to the broad idea of mapping cartography. Maps that don't really work.
No, that don't. And I think we're all kind of familiar with, Google sort of misleading us, and Google sort of, at one point being just sort of thinking of, when it was first developed, it was actually creating a series of anomalies, like it was getting it quite wrong. So, what does that mean when we rely on such technology, so heavily? And also, there's also that other whole conversation about surveillance and the drone, which I don't need to talk about. But yeah, those sort of, those failures of that.
I had another question about today when we had a quick coffee today. I was thinking after you left about the fact that you're an artist and academic, and so you live in a kind of verbal, written space with a PhD, all those sorts of things. And I was and after you left, I was looking through the book, and I was thinking it's a very non-verbal book. There's a bit of text in there, but actually it's without language somehow. And then I reread the thing at the back, the text at the back, and you talked about the German thing and forgetting German. I guess how much of that kind of plays into your practice, or in a kind of in an unconscious way, I guess maybe. But this idea of, I'm just interested.
Do you mean the non-verbal, or do you mean the academic thing? No,
the non-verbal thing. The idea of kind of without words or without language, which the book is very much about that in some way. Even the text you've got in there is other people's texts.
Yep.
It's not your own words.
No, I think part of it was that the project was so big in terms of imagery, like in terms of the material that I made, that I don't know, I guess I'm sort of... I really wanted to trust the visual with this project. Like, I can write and I have written, but it's also a very different thing. I think when I put words and kind of... even the idea of putting... We had at one point text in this, there was throughout, there was some images through, and we removed it at one point because it just seemed to be like an annotation or a kind of something that was trying to explain something, and I really didn't want to explain. I just wanted this work to be anchored by these untethered notes, as they're called at the front, and by Ramona's, really beautifully insightful text in the back. And I think we're often really pressured in some ways as artists and academics to move between both. And I don't know about other people, but I find that incredibly difficult. And I think at a certain time in life, when I have children and I have other things, I cannot do both. I can't do both
at the same time.
Yeah, so I choose not to. I choose to do one thing, especially at the moment. And I think, at other times it might come back. And I have written, I think, I haven't written for the book, but I did write a kind of text, which is a monologue, a kind of artwork, I guess, that accompanies an installation that was exhibited as part of Nihilartikel at UNSW Galleries, actually. And at What Space. So I do it, but I think it's not the sort of... It's a reflective sort of some kind of text, but yeah.
Yeah, because I was thinking about the diving too, which is obviously also non-verbal as well, right? Like you're in your own kind of space. You can't communicate sign language. I guess all these things were just playing around in my head, and it was really kind of... It felt quite intoxicating looking through the book again and just thinking about that there's no words in there, or very little at least. As well. This idea of it doesn't then ground it, that it's without... Like I think in the text... at the back it talks about dislocation, loss of location, dissolution of boundaries, like all the same thing, but said in multiple different ways. No solid ground, all these things. I found that in terms of the non-verbal, I found that really interesting. Like it's not placed verbally, and it's not placed kind of physically or something as well.
I think it's also, 20 years ago when I started practicing, and just after art school, I had a very autobiographical, biographical kind of sense of work happening, where it was very much about, things that were quite personal in relation to, the story of migration and my family. But I don't know if I wanted to, but it happened that I wanted to distance that personal thing away from the way that I worked, and photography was a great tool to do that. And so I think I've always talked about it, but I've talked about it around the edges. It hasn't been a kind of this equals that. This hasn't been, it hasn't been very clear. But I think it's starting to come back as well. Like I mentioned today, like it's starting to come back, and I think, not sure what that's all about, but there's sort of work that I'm making now for an exhibition this year, and which is sort of really quite personal and speaks to that movement much more loudly.
Can I ask about the book, just in terms of the object itself and just the conversation? And obviously, it's larger than than a standard kind of maybe some other primitive books that have been done in the past with different photographers is quite big, but it also has a very tactile kind of sense to it in terms of the exposed spine and the material and the floppiness of the book and all those things. I just wonder about those sorts of decisions. I know that Dan loves floppy books, but love a floppy book. But does that I'm always interested in that kind of conversation, that toing and froing, because there's a billion options, in a way, and well, not a billion, but there's a couple.
There are a billion options really, in a lot of ways. We really want to keep it simple, didn't we? Big was a part of it, just in order to actually deal with scale and the idea of being able to zoom in and out. Because I feel like that's what it does. And the grid that was created for it was just a way for it to move around, in a way to think about it in the physical way, like particularly the way the work has been exhibited and how it has edges and, as you were saying before, kind of bumps up against each other and has these different ways of approaching it. In terms of the design of the book, that was what the feeling, the thing that made sense about it, right? And that's where it was like, these things have to overlay, because as single items, it's just, they're not in relationship with each other. And those conversations we had, particularly about diving and stuff, and like the cover, you see the rock, but then you're also seeing the water. They kind of have a relationship though. And there's some things in there where there's rocks and there's prints that are printed in silver that aren't even the same image, that feel like they're part of the same image. And it's just kind of this idea of trying to work with, like traditionally with a photo book, you're actually just working with a series of images, and this is not, it was a bit of a different thing. It was like, how do you create them as photo media as well, like, or as a material? It's a new print. It's like a new print and a new idea of looking at the work rather than as a single object, like this.
And I think that, for me, it was also about, like the atlas, about a reference book. They're usually quite large things, right? And they're usually printed on sort of paper that isn't, too precious. This is beautiful paper, but it's also not a fine art kind of paper. It's it's quite a light. Dan, you were quite sort of, we talk about this sort of idea of transparency, or being able to, what is it called? Like a...
Just see the social...
like a shadowing that happens through the pages. So... So the scale and this idea of sifting through something, and I remember being in Belfast, and we spent a bit of time together. I met her at Sydney Airport as I was going to Belfast. Her name is Maureen, and we spent time there because she had travelled quite a lot during her time. And at one point I said to her, because I was really curious about the places she had travelled, because it literally sounded like she'd been everywhere. Her husband was a Presbyterian minister, which lent itself to a lot of travel in that time. And so we sat there with this atlas, and she sort of spoke to all the places she'd been and to all the place names that had been, that had changed, or to all the borders that had also shifted, which is again big part of this beginnings of this work. But this looking through something, through an atlas, also through a family album, through. Perhaps not my children's age, but, like those of us that, have albums and look through them, it kind of has that kind of, you spend time going back and forth. And I think what you said was really lovely, thank you, about, getting lost and going back and double checking that you haven't seen that before. That was something that we really would, wanting to do.
The whole thing's a bit of a riddle in some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. Constant reassessment. I still don't know what's going on.
Flip it the other way.
In the best possible way.
Yeah, like the form wasn't like a huge part of the discussion, to be honest, was it? It was like we just wanted something big, and it was more about the work and how the work played with each other on the page. And
so you took each kind of image and on its own kind of merit and went that way, you mean?
I think we started with just single images, and then we just started layering. And it came, about page count, so you start to pull things in, and how do you do that? Like, it's always a bit of a negotiation with a book, but also sometimes the form does speak to something. But in this case, it was more about the design than the form. So not the book itself, but the way the thing worked and functioned. Yeah,
and you can sort of see that even with even with things like the cover. With at each end it's like a sewn-on cover, so it's like 4 pages, and it essentially, like the cover, even though it's quite a different sort of stock to it on the inside, it has a particular sort of texture and things. It's sort of still like the sequence and the system is sort of embedded into the cover as well. You know what I mean? There's not these sort of, I guess, clear boundaries, like you have a hardcover book which is very formal, and then you have the content inside. It's more like everything just bleeds into each other, and that design language sort of works its way around the different materials.
But it's also big enough to kind of feel quite epic too. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like it feels grand as well in that way because of the size of it. In some way.
Grand but floppy.
One of the things that was on my wish list, which we got to do, was the binding.
The
Coptic binding, which I just say revealed, undone binding, but I was really adamant that needed to happen because for me it spoke to the unhinging of the atlases. Like it had to be that way. Thank you for all agreeing and making it happen. But yeah, it was really important. That little detail of materiality.
Yeah, and it's nice how that...
It's also cool as well.
I know, the thing is, I know it's cool, but I wanted to do it way at the beginning before it got cool.
Ah, right, okay.
Just saying,
You started the trend.
I did. The book is way delayed.
It's been delayed for decades.
Yeah.
But also, it just happens to be the most functional binding for this kind of thing as well.
It's true.
Been laid so perfect with flat beyond.
Can I ask a question about the show? Because it was shown at New South Wales
University
of
UNSW Galleries.
And I just wonder, and maybe some people here saw the show. I didn't see the show. I just wonder about the kind of the differences between the show and the book. And of course, I'm a firm believer in the book being its own work in itself. So I'm not saying that it's not a translation of the show, but it is a translation, but it's not not trying to do what the show does in book form. If that makes sense. But I just wonder what were the kind of decisions that were made, going through the process of putting the show together and installing it and all those, and then coming to the book, and what things kind of got omitted or added or changed, or your thinking in terms of how those, because I think that's a really interesting discussion with yourself and also with the designer, but with the curator, there's so many different kind of moving parts to it.
Yeah. I think the key thing was the structure, was that kind of the aluminium sculptural piece that was about 9 by 3 metres, and it sort of held the photographs. It kind of held them. They were propped. They were kind of folded over, not folded over, yes, they were folded over, and they appeared like they were falling off. And as Paul sort of described, I think, before, there was this sense of looking through across things into other things that were reflecting from other bits, and the work was just exhibited also at the University of Newcastle Gallery's What Space recently, which was quite lovely to see it in that space and to see it at Carriageworks a few months before that. So each time that work has been shown, it has slightly changed in terms of where it is, because there are mirrors involved in the work. So it mirrors the floor or the walls. So I kind of adapted that a couple of times. So it was really, I mean, I do remember sort of showing you and kind of talking about that structure and kind of going, that's what this is, this sort of sense of not actually knowing what you're looking at and in which order you're meant to see it. Yeah.
And the idea of mirrors, like talking about mirrors, we're thinking about, like, because I kept coming up with this word portals for all those doors.
Yeah.
And how it just is those kinds of passing through places. And that's kind of what it felt like to me, you know, and that's why there's like a page that's fully silver that bounces back to something else. It's like a mirror as well. Like, so it's just really trying to reflect those things a little bit.
And therefore the repetition is almost kind of coming and going through and back and forward, etc. Yeah, because I always find that really interesting, that translation, you know, whenever I see a show and know the book, or sometimes you know the show but not, and then you see the book, or vice versa, the other way around, sorry. You know, I think it's always really interesting, that kind of process of translation, especially people who haven't done books before. I mean, you've done books before, but, you know, especially for someone who's doing their book the first time, there's a real sense of letting go, isn't there, of the show?
Yeah, absolutely. You know? But I had to as soon as I met Paul. Like, that was part of the deal, really. There was a kind of trust with, you know, knowing Paul's reputation, and like knowing kind of what you do and knowing the work, that there was a kind of synergy that we had in terms of realising this,
Yeah, I think the only 2 photo books I've actually ever done, like full photo books, this is one of them, and Eliza's was the other one. It was the same gesture. Yeah, absolutely.
You know, I can't. That's the thing. I guess even when we started the edit on this book, I think, you know, seeing the bodies of work in different folders, the different sort of types of photography, I had no idea how we're going to make it into a book. And as a non-designer, I just couldn't imagine it. You know,
because traditionally you lay these things out, you know, and you lay out the spreads, and you know exactly what the book's going to be. And as a designer, you generally plop some images in. And if you get to design something, it's the typography that goes in the book. That's the relationship to the photo, which is a really interesting thing. But it's actually, it is that simple. But this was just living on a computer too. And I think that's a kind of interesting little thing that I tried to work with, that idea of, like, you know, moving that grid, creating squares and different shapes out of those images too. It was all like, you can't even look at it, you can't pull it out. I mean, you printed it out. The whole book. I
printed each version that I
literally
received,
printed the whole book out.
Edit. I would print the whole thing out and cut it to size and sticky tape it so I could see it. You know, there was like 3 of those made. I don't know how. I have to do that.
Actually, one thing I have to point out is perhaps the sexiest barcode. I think.
There's one person in the room who's interested in me.
I have a few little thank yous. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Can I do that? I mean, it's all in the book, but I just did want to say, you know, obviously thank you to Paul and Kim, you know, for, you know, just the work and the kind of conversations and this incredible kind of journey we had to make it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And to Ramona and, you know, who wrote for the book back in the end of 2020, I think. And Jose de Silva, who's been really instrumental in kind of the Nihilartikel project in terms of the exhibition, and that we worked on for UNSW Galleries and the whole team's support at UNSW. And Gillian Shaw and Peter Rake, who were curators that kind of took on the exhibition work both at UNSW, both at, you know, the University of Newcastle and at UQ Art Museum as part of projects there, which I'm very grateful for. And the curators in Malta, Nicole Behrman and Francesca Manigon, who kind of took this up, you know, back in 2018 or 19 when we first met, which the sort of sculptural work was shown at. So, yeah, kind of really great to have that support team around me, and my gallerist, Sally Dan Cuthbert, of course, and Justine and Dan and Ash. Thank you so much for, you know, for this project, which we've been cooking up for a couple of years. Yeah, it's been great to do with you. Thank you.